He said he would never allow love to destroy him again. But on that silent night, the purity of a young girl changed his destiny. 9 months later, she returns with a baby in her arms and eyes full of pain. If you like love stories and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling where you're listening from. He met her on the night when the darkness inside him threatened to swallow him whole. Dante Fiori wasn't just an untouchable magnate of the energy sector, heir to a European empire forged on family pacts, hidden inheritances and deadly silences. He was also the man who, at 42, carried in his body the weight of power, and in his soul the scar of a guilt that neither time, nor billions, nor fleeting women could erase. Since the tragic death of his younger brother, a suicide amid a scandal that forever stained the Fiori name, Dante had lived under a rigid rule: never love again, never trust again, never allow himself to be touched. The November rain hammered against the windows of Thornfield Manor with the relentless fury of nature unleashed, each drop striking the glass like bullets against armor. The exclusive retreat, nestled deep in the Yorkshire Dales, stood like a fortress against the storm, its Georgian walls thick enough to keep out the world, but never quite thick enough to silence the ghosts within. Dante owned this sanctuary but rarely visited, preferring the cold efficiency of his London penthouse to the memories that lurked in every shadow of the ancestral home. Tonight was different. Tonight, he had fled here like a wounded animal seeking its den, abandoning a gala ceremony in his honor at the London Hilton, where politicians and business leaders had gathered to celebrate his latest renewable energy acquisition. The Meridian Group had just secured the largest offshore wind farm contract in European history, a deal worth £12 billion that would cement Dante's position as the undisputed king of sustainable energy. The Prime Minister himself had been there to shake his hand, to pose for photographs that would grace the front pages of the Financial Times and the Telegraph. But as he'd stood on that stage, accepting accolades and applause, Dante had felt nothing but the familiar weight of emptiness pressing down on his chest. The smiles were calculated, the congratulations hollow, and beneath it all was the constant awareness that none of it mattered. Success without someone to share it with was just another form of failure. And Dante had been failing for 10 years now, ever since Marcus put that gun to his head in the very library where Dante now sought refuge. The manor house sprawled across the Yorkshire landscape like a sleeping giant, its ivy-covered walls and leaded windows speaking of centuries of Fiori occupation. 3 generations of his family had walked these halls, had made their fortunes and lost their souls within these walls. It was here that his great-grandfather had first struck oil in the North Sea, here that his grandfather had diversified into renewable energy long before it became fashionable, and here that his father had taught both his sons that love was a luxury the Fiori family couldn't afford. The lesson had cost Marcus his life, and it was slowly killing Dante from the inside out. He stood now in the library, a crystal tumbler of 30-year-old Macallan in his hand, staring at the portrait above the marble fireplace. His grandfather, Salvatore Fiori, gazed down with those same amber eyes that Dante saw in the mirror each morning, eyes that held secrets, eyes that had watched empires rise and fall, eyes that had never learned to love without destroying. The old man had built the family fortune on the principle that sentiment was weakness, that emotion was the enemy of success. He had died alone in this very room, surrounded by his money and his legacy, but untouched by human warmth. Dante was beginning to understand how that felt. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. First editions of Dickens and Austen stood alongside treatises on economics and energy policy, a collection that spoke of both culture and commerce, beauty and brutality, existing side by side. It was a fitting metaphor for the Fiori family itself, polished surfaces hiding dark truths, elegant facades concealing the rot beneath. Outside, the wind howled across the moors like a living thing, rattling the ancient window panes and sending leaves spiraling through the air like lost souls. Dante had dismissed most of the staff for the evening, wanting only solitude and the burn of whiskey to keep him company. His head of security, Williams, maintained a skeleton crew of guards, but they knew better than to disturb him when he was in this mood. The black mood that had been building for weeks, fed by another failed relationship, Another woman who had seen only his wealth and power. Another reminder that true connection was something other men enjoyed, but Dante would never possess. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke through his brooding like a stone thrown through glass. Soft, hesitant steps that didn't belong to his security team or the handful of maintenance staff he kept on permanent payroll. Someone was walking through the private wing, an area that was clearly marked as off-limits to all but family and invited guests. It could be an intruder, though the thought seemed unlikely given the state-of-the-art security system that surrounded the property. More likely it was some member of the cleaning crew who had lost their way or misunderstood their instructions. Dante set down his glass with deliberate precision, the crystal making a soft chiming sound against the mahogany side table. He moved toward the door with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to being the apex predator in any situation. 6 feet 4 inches of controlled power, his body was honed to perfection by years of fencing, martial arts, and the kind of discipline that came from knowing that weakness could be fatal in his world. He wore his authority like armor, and very few people had ever seen him without it. The footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then came a crash, the unmistakable noise of objects scattering, followed by a muffled curse in a voice that was unmistakably female. The words were low, frustrated, tinged with an accent that spoke of northern England but carried undertones of something else, something that made Dante's pulse quicken unexpectedly. If this was another attempt by some socialite or journalist to gain unauthorized access to him, they would regret it. His privacy was sacred, protected with the same ruthlessness he brought to his business dealings. Too many people had tried to use proximity to him as a stepping stone to their own ambitions. And Dante had learned to view every unexpected encounter as a potential threat. He rounded the corner with the silent efficiency of a hunting cat and stopped dead in his tracks. Young woman knelt on the antique Persian carpet, frantically gathering scattered cleaning supplies from an overturned bucket. Her dark hair had escaped from what must have been a tight professional bun, falling in lustrous waves around her face as she worked with quick, desperate movements. She wore the simple grey uniform of the cleaning staff, a shapeless garment designed for function rather than form. But even the utilitarian clothing couldn't hide the delicate femininity of her frame. There was something different about her, something that made Dante's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably lovely in a way that seemed almost otherworldly in the dim corridor lighting. It was the way she moved, with a careful precision that spoke of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had clearly taught her that her presence was unwelcome. "You're in the wrong wing," Dante said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade forged in ice. She looked up, and for a moment that stretched into infinity, time seemed to stop. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering over the North Sea, grey-blue and infinite, framed by dark lashes that couldn't hide the exhaustion that lived beneath. Her face was a study in delicate contradictions, high cheekbones that spoke of aristocratic breeding, paired with a mouth that was full and sensual, skin that was pale as porcelain, but marked with the kind of weariness that came from too many sleepless nights and not enough hope. She couldn't have been more than 22, but there was something ancient in her gaze, a weariness that spoke of pain far beyond her years. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, endured more than any person should have to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft lilt of Yorkshire with undertones of something else, Spanish perhaps or Portuguese. The combination was musical, lilting, and it did things to Dante's nervous system that he hadn't experienced in years. "I didn't know anyone was here. Mrs. Patterson told me to clean this floor before morning, but I must have gotten turned around. The layout of this place is like a maze." She gestured helplessly at the mess around her, bottles of cleaning solution, rags, a mop that had fallen from her cart. Her hands were shaking slightly, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion Dante couldn't tell. But something about those trembling fingers made his chest tighten in a way that was both unfamiliar and unwelcome. "What's your name?" Dante stepped closer, and he saw her flinch almost imperceptibly. The movement was subtle, barely there, but his eyes were trained to catch such things. Someone had taught this girl to be afraid, had conditioned her to expect violence from men who moved too quickly or spoke too sharply. "Alina," she said, her eyes dropping to the expensive carpet beneath her knees. Elena Vasquez. The surname hit him like a physical blow, like a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping for air he couldn't seem to find. Vasquez. The same name as the woman who had destroyed his brother, who had seduced Marcus with promises of love and devotion before bleeding him dry financially and emotionally, leaving him with nothing but shame and a loaded Webley revolver that had belonged to their great-grandfather. But this girl couldn't be more than 22. She would have been a child when Marcus died, barely old enough to understand what was happening in the adult world of scandal and betrayal that had ultimately claimed his brother's life. Yet here she was, kneeling before him like some twisted echo from the past, a ghost made flesh to torment him. Vasquez, he repeated, tasting the name like poison on his tongue. Any relation to Elena Vasquez? The color drained from her face so quickly that Dante thought she might faint. Her hands stilled on the cleaning supplies, her knuckles going white as she gripped a bottle of furniture polish like it might anchor her to reality. She was my mother, Elena said quietly, and Dante felt the world shift beneath his feet like the deck of a ship in a storm. Elena Vasquez had been a Spanish dancer, beautiful and wild and dangerous in the way that only truly damaged women could be. She had captivated Marcus during his gap year in Madrid, when their father had sent him abroad to sow his wild oats before settling into the responsibilities of the family business. Elena had been older, experienced, worldly in ways that had fascinated and ultimately destroyed Dante's naive younger brother. The affair had lasted 6 months, during which Marcus had showered Elena with gifts, attention, and ultimately access to sensitive information about the family's business dealings. When it ended, when Marcus finally came to his senses and tried to break things off, Elena had revealed her true nature. The photographs she had taken, the documents she had copied, the recordings she had made, it had all been part of an elaborate blackmail scheme designed to extract millions from the Fiore family. The scandal had rocked their world. Newspapers had published grainy photos of Marcus entering and leaving Elena's apartment. Business rivals had somehow obtained confidential information about pending deals. The family's reputation, carefully cultivated over 3 generations, had been torn to shreds in a matter of weeks. Marcus had spiraled into depression and self-destruction, unable to cope with the shame and guilt of what his naivety had cost the family. He had started drinking heavily, taking dangerous risks, pushing away everyone who tried to help him. And then on a grey December morning exactly 10 years ago, he had walked into this very library, put their great-grandfather's Webley to his temple, and pulled the trigger. The note he left behind was brief and devastating. I can't live with what I've done to our family. I can't live with what she made me become. I'm sorry. Dante, take care of them for me. And now Elena's daughter was here in his house, on her knees before him like some cruel joke played by a sadistic universe. Get up, Dante commanded, his voice harsh with memories and pain. Look at me. Elena rose slowly, her movements graceful despite her obvious distress. She was smaller than her mother had been in the photographs Dante had seen, more delicate, but the resemblance was unmistakable now that he was looking for it. The same dark hair that caught the light like black silk, the same olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean heritage, the same bone structure that could have graced the covers of fashion magazines. But where Elena had been calculated and predatory, this girl seemed fragile, broken. Where her mother had moved with the confidence of a woman who knew her own power, Elena carried herself like someone who had learned to expect disappointment, who had been taught that good things didn't happen to people like her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his amber eyes boring into her grey ones with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. "How long have you been working at Thornfield?" 3 months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Patterson hired me through the agency. I needed the job. I have nowhere else to go." "Nowhere else to go," Dante repeated, his tone mocking and bitter. "How convenient. The daughter of the woman who killed my brother just happens to find employment in my home, just happens to be cleaning the very wing where he died. What are the odds of such a coincidence?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew exactly who he was, what her mother had done. The guilt was written across her face in invisible ink, a legacy of shame she carried like a birthmark she couldn't conceal. "Don't lie to me." Dante stepped closer, Close enough to see the fine dusting of freckles across her nose, close enough to smell the faint scent of her perfume, something clean and simple that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Galena Vasquez seduced my brother, blackmailed him, destroyed him piece by piece, until he couldn't see any way out except a bullet. He put a gun to his head because of what she did to him, because of the shame she brought on our family. And now you're here playing the innocent little cleaning girl. What's your game? What do you want from me? Tears gathered in Alina's eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but she didn't let them fall. There was steel beneath the vulnerability, a core of strength that had been forged in fires Dante could only imagine. "My mother is dead," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the emotion he could see threatening to overwhelm her. "She died of an overdose when I was 16. Whatever she did, whatever happened between her and your brother, I had nothing to do with it. I was a child, Mr. Fiore. I was just a child trying to survive." "A child," Dante laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the walls like broken glass. "Do you think that matters? Do you think innocence absolves you of the sins of your blood? You're Elena's daughter. That makes you guilty by birth, stained by association. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Miss Vasquez." The words were cruel, designed to wound, calculated to break whatever defenses she had managed to construct around her heart. But as soon as they left his mouth, Dante regretted them. There was something broken in this girl, something that reminded him painfully of Marcus in those final months before his death. The same haunted look, the same careful way of moving through the world, as if expecting it to shatter at any moment. "I should go," Alina said, bending to gather the last of her cleaning supplies with movements that were carefully controlled, precisely measured. "I'll finish this floor in the morning, or perhaps someone else could—" "No." Dante caught her wrist as she stood, felt her pulse racing beneath his fingers like a trapped bird's heartbeat. Her skin was soft, warm, unmarked by the calluses he might have expected from someone who did manual labor for a living. "You'll finish it now. But you said—" "I said you were in the wrong wing. I didn't say you could leave." His grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt but enough to remind her who held the power in this situation. "Clean the room, all of it, and then we'll talk about what you're really doing here." Alina nodded, her eyes downcast, accepting his dominance with a resignation that spoke of long practice in submission. Dante released her and settled into one of the leather armchairs by the fireplace, ostensibly returning to his whiskey and his brooding, but actually watching her work with an intensity that surprised him. She moved with quiet efficiency, dusting the furniture with careful attention to detail, straightening the books that lined the walls with reverent touches, polishing the silver frames that held photographs he never looked at anymore. There was something almost meditative about her movements, a gracefulness that spoke of natural elegance, despite her humble circumstances. She was beautiful, he admitted to himself as he watched her work. Not with the obvious in-your-face sexuality that her mother had wielded like a weapon, but with something subtler, more dangerous. There was an innocence about her that made him want to either protect her or corrupt her. He wasn't entirely sure which impulse was stronger. When she reached for a book on one of the higher shelves, stretching up on her toes to dust the leather binding, her uniform rode up slightly at the sleeve. Dante's breath caught as he glimpsed them, faint white scars circling her wrist like ghostly bracelets, old but unmistakable. Someone had hurt this girl, had marked her in ways that went far beyond the physical. "How did you get those?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Alina froze, her hand still reaching for the book, her body going rigid with tension. "Get what?" "The scars on your wrists." She pulled her sleeves down quickly, her face flushing with shame that made Dante's chest tighten with an emotion he refused to name. "It's nothing. An old accident." "That's not an accident," Dante stood, crossing to where she stood by the towering bookshelf, his movements predatory and precise. "Those are deliberate, precise. Someone tied you up. Someone hurt you." "Please," Alina whispered, backing away until she hit the wall, trapped between centuries of Fiore history and the man who currently embodied all of their power and ruthlessness. "I don't want to talk about it." But Dante was relentless when he wanted answers. It was what made him such a formidable businessman, this ability to strip away lies and defenses until only truth remained, naked and vulnerable and impossible to deny. "Who hurt you?" he pressed, placing his hands on either side of her head, caging her against the wall with his body. He could feel the heat radiating from her, could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, could smell the faint scent of fear and something else, something that made his blood run hot and dangerous. "Your father? A boyfriend? Some man who thought he could take what he wanted because you were young and alone, and nobody would believe you." "Stop," she said, but the word came out broken, defeated, a plea rather than a command. "Tell me," Dante commanded, his voice low and intense, his amber eyes boring into her grey ones with an intensity that made her shiver. "Tell me who marked you, who hurt you, who taught you to flinch when men moved too quickly." "My father," she whispered finally, the words torn from her throat like fragments of broken glass. "Before he left, before my mother died, he used to hurt us both. He said we deserved it, that we were worthless, that no one would ever want us unless we learned to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention we could get." The admission hung between them like a live wire, crackling with pain and secrets, and the kind of trauma that left scars on the soul. Dante found himself studying her face with new eyes, seeing the delicate bone structure, the way her lips trembled slightly when she spoke of painful things, the careful way she held herself as if expecting a blow. She was nothing like what he'd expected Elena Vasquez's daughter to be. There was no calculation here, no manipulation, no sign of the predatory instincts that had made her mother so dangerous. Just a broken girl trying to survive in a world that had been nothing but cruel to her from the moment she drew her first breath. "And after he left?" Dante asked, his voice gentler now, though his body still held her captive against the wall. "Foster homes, group homes, places where girls like me learn to disappear, to be invisible, to never ask for more than we're given." Alina's eyes met his, and he saw a flash of steel beneath the vulnerability, a core of strength that had somehow survived everything that had been done to her. "I learned to clean, to cook, to take care of other people's messes. I learned to be grateful for a roof over my head and food in my stomach and the absence of violence. I learned that love was a luxury I couldn't afford." "But you're not invisible now," Dante said, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek without conscious thought, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way she leaned into his touch, despite everything that had happened between them. "I see you. I see all of you." Something shifted in the air between them, an electric tension that had nothing to do with anger or revenge, and everything to do with the most primitive of human connections. Alina's lips parted slightly, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, and Dante found himself leaning closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name or control or resist. This was madness. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of emotional entanglement that had destroyed his brother and left their family bleeding. But as he looked into Alina's storm-grey eyes, as he felt the warmth of her breath against his face, as he breathed in the clean, simple scent of her perfume, Dante found that he didn't care about danger or madness or the lessons of the past. All he cared about was the woman in front of him, vulnerable and beautiful and broken in ways that called to something deep in his soul. "Sir," came a voice from the doorway, sharp and urgent, cutting through the moment like a blade through silk. They sprang apart like guilty children caught in forbidden play, Alina's back hitting the wall with enough force to rattle the picture frames, Dante spinning around with the controlled violence of a predator, disturbed in his lair. Williams, his head of security, stood in the entrance to the library, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious tension crackling in the air between his employer and the young woman pressed against the wall. Williams was an ex-SAS officer, a man who had seen combat in 3 different wars and understood the value of discretion in all its forms. He'd been with the Fiore family for 8 years, ever since Dante had personally recruited him after a mutual acquaintance recommended his services. He was one of the few people alive who knew all of Dante's secrets, and his loyalty was absolute. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," Williams said, his tone professional and calm, "but there's been an incident in the East Wing. A guest became aggressive with one of the staff members." Dante's jaw clenched, the muscle jumping beneath his skin as he processed the implications. The few guests currently staying at Thornfield were there by invitation only. Hand-picked business associates and political contacts who understood the value of discretion and the consequences of overstepping boundaries. "Which guest?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet in the way that those who knew him had learned to fear. "Lord Pemberton, sir. He's had quite a bit to drink this evening, and when Miss Chen attempted to clean his room according to schedule, he made certain advances. She managed to get away, but he's demanding to see you now. Says he wants to file a complaint about the quality of service. Claims the staff are being deliberately provocative." "The quality of service," Dante repeated, his voice carrying the kind of ice that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Theodore Pemberton was a bloated aristocrat who had inherited his title, along with a fortune built on centuries of exploitation and cruelty. He was the kind of man who believed that wealth and breeding gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from whomever he pleased, particularly if they were female and in service positions. The fact that he was even here was a testament to Dante's occasional need to maintain certain political connections. But his patience for the man's behavior had just evaporated entirely. "Where is he now?" Dante asked, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "In his room, sir. Quite intoxicated and becoming more belligerent by the minute. He's also made some rather unpleasant comments about wanting to sample the local talent, and specifically mentioned seeing a pretty little Spanish girl in the corridors." Dante's gaze snapped to Alina, who had gone pale as moonlight during the exchange. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was pressing herself against the wall as if she could somehow disappear into the antique wallpaper. "Have you encountered Lord Pemberton during your time here?" Dante asked her, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest like a pressure cooker approaching critical mass. "Once," she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Last week. He was returning to his room when I was cleaning the hallway. He tried to corner me in the supply closet, started saying things about how pretty I was, how he could make my life easier if I was nice to him. He grabbed my arm, tried to pull me inside with him. I managed to get away, but he was angry, said I was ungrateful, that girls like me should know better than to refuse a man like him." The rage that filled Dante was sudden and consuming, a red tide that threatened to wash away years of careful control and civilized behavior. The thought of that pig putting his hands on Alina, of frightening her, of adding to the catalogue of trauma she already carried, it made him want to do violence. Real, permanent, irreversible violence. He had killed men before, though few people knew it. During his military service, in self-defense, in protection of assets and personnel, he understood the mechanics of death, the precise application of force required to end a life quickly and efficiently. And right now, looking at the fear in Alina's eyes, he wanted nothing more than to walk upstairs and introduce Theodore Pemberton to those particular skills. "Williams," he said, his voice controlled despite the fury burning in his chest like molten steel. "Please escort Lord Pemberton from the premises immediately. Use whatever means necessary." "Sir?" Williams looked genuinely surprised. Pemberton was a guest, however unpleasant, and ejecting him would cause talk in certain circles. "Are you certain? He does have connections in Parliament, and his displeasure could complicate some of our pending legislation." "I don't care if he's related to the bloody Queen," Dante snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Get him out of my house now, and Williams, make sure word gets out in the right circles about what kind of man he really is. I'm sure certain newspapers would be very interested in stories about his behavior toward female staff members. I'm sure his wife would be particularly fascinated to learn about his extracurricular activities." Williams nodded, understanding the underlying message. By morning, Theodore Pemberton would find himself persona non grata in half the drawing rooms of London, his reputation in tatters, his political connections severed. The Fiore family had that kind of power, that kind of reach. They could destroy a man's entire life with a few carefully placed phone calls and strategic leaks to the right journalists. "And if he resists?" Williams asked. "Then remind him that this is private property, and I have every right to defend it and its occupants by whatever means I deem necessary." Dante replied, his amber eyes glowing with barely contained violence. "I'm sure he'll see reason." Williams disappeared into the shadows with the silent efficiency that had made him invaluable to the family, leaving Dante and Alina alone again. The library felt smaller now, more intimate, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe with their own life. "You didn't have to do that," Alina said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been wonder. I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for a long time. Can you? Dante moved closer again, drawn by the magnetic pull that seemed to exist between them, something that defied logic and reason, and every lesson his family had ever taught him about the dangers of emotional attachment. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've spent your whole life taking care of yourself, fighting battles that should never have been yours to fight, and it's left you covered in scars both visible and hidden. That's not your problem to solve, Alina said, but there was less conviction in her voice now, as if part of her wanted to believe that someone might actually care enough to fight for her. Maybe not, Dante admitted, reaching out to take her hand in his, marveling at how small and delicate it felt against his own scarred fingers. But I'm going to solve it anyway. I'm going to make sure that no one ever hurts you again, that no one ever makes you feel small or worthless or afraid. He turned her hand palm up, revealing the faint white lines across her wrist that told stories of pain and desperation and survival against impossible odds. The scars were old, barely visible now unless you knew to look for them, but they represented something that made his chest tight, with an emotion he had spent years trying to forget how to feel. These don't define you, he said quietly, his thumb tracing the marks with surprising gentleness for a man who had built his reputation on ruthlessness and iron control. Whatever happened to you, whoever hurt you, whoever tried to break you, it doesn't make you less than whole. It makes you stronger than they could ever understand. Alina's eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink back, but one escaped anyway, rolling down her cheek like liquid silver in the firelight. You don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. You don't know what I've done, what I've had to do to survive. You don't know how broken I really am, don't I? Dante pulled her closer until she was standing between his legs, her body warm against his, her scent filling his nostrils and making his head spin with wants and needs he had buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. I know what it's like to carry guilt that isn't yours to carry. I know what it's like to be defined by someone else's sins, to live in the shadow of tragedies you couldn't prevent. I know what it's like to believe you don't deserve anything good in this world, because everything you touch turns to ash. And do you? She whispered, her storm-grey eyes searching his face as if looking for some sign of hope in the darkness that surrounded them both. Deserve something good? The question hit him like a physical blow, like a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping for air that seemed suddenly too thick to breathe. Did he deserve happiness? Did he deserve love? He had built an empire on the foundation of his family's blood-soaked legacy, had made billions while his brother rotted in the ground, had power and influence and everything a man could want, except the one thing that actually mattered. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that he didn't deserve love, that the Fiore curse would destroy anyone foolish enough to care for him. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick that he had begun to believe they were permanent, that he was destined to live and die alone, with only his money and his regrets for company. I used to think I didn't, he said finally, his voice raw with honesty that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. I used to think that loving me was a death sentence, that anyone who got too close would end up destroyed the way Marcus was destroyed. I convinced myself that isolation was protection, that emptiness was safety. And now? Alina asked, her hand coming up to touch his face with a tenderness that nearly undid him completely. Now, looking at you, touching you, seeing the strength it took for you to survive everything that's been done to you. Dante leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to feel something other than rage and emptiness for the first time in a decade. I'm starting to wonder if I was wrong. I'm starting to think that maybe the real curse isn't loving someone. Maybe the real curse is choosing to live without love because you're too afraid to take the risk. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fragile and terrifying and absolutely necessary. Alina's hand was still on his face, her thumb brushing across his cheekbone, with a gentleness that spoke of understanding, of recognition, of someone who knew what it felt like to be broken and still choose to keep breathing. I should go, she said, but she made no move to pull away, her body betraying the words even as they left her lips. Should you? Dante's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her lower lip in a caress that was both question and promise. Or should you stay and let me show you what it feels like to be treated like something precious? Let me show you what it means to be wanted for who you are, rather than what you can provide." "I'm not precious," Alina whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I'm damaged goods, used up, broken beyond repair. I'm the daughter of the woman who destroyed your brother. I'm everything you should hate." "You're wrong," Dante said fiercely, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "You're the most beautiful thing I've seen in years, and if you'll let me, I'll spend however long it takes proving it to you. I'll show you that your mother's sins aren't yours to carry, that the pain others have inflicted on you doesn't define your worth." For a moment, she wavered. He could see the longing in her eyes, the desperate need to be held, to be wanted, to be treated with something other than cruelty or indifference. But then reality crashed back in, the weight of their respective histories, and the impossibility of their situations settling over them like a suffocating blanket. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped back, pulling her hand from his face and wrapping her arms around herself, as if she could hold all her broken pieces together through sheer will. "I'm sorry, but I can't. This is madness. You're you and I'm nobody. I'm the help. I'm the daughter of your enemy. This can't happen." And then she was gone, fleeing the library like a ghost escaping back to whatever shadows had spawned it, leaving Dante alone with the fire and his whiskey and the sudden, overwhelming certainty that his carefully ordered world had just been turned completely upside down. He stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the place where she had been, trying to understand what had just happened to him. For the first time in 10 years, since Marcus's death had turned his heart to ice, he had felt something other than anger or emptiness. For the first time in a decade, he had wanted something more than revenge or success or the cold satisfaction of power. He had wanted her. Alina Vasquez, daughter of his enemy, bearer of scars both visible and hidden, survivor of traumas that would have broken lesser souls. He had wanted to hold her, protect her, claim her in ways that went far beyond the physical. He had wanted to heal the wounds that others had inflicted, to show her what it meant to be cherished rather than used. And the intensity of that want terrified him more than any corporate takeover or family scandal ever had, because wanting meant vulnerability. Wanting meant weakness. And in the world of the Fiore family, weakness was a luxury that could cost everything. But as Dante finished his whiskey and made his way through the darkened corridors to his bedroom, he knew with absolute certainty that it was already too late. Whether he could afford it or not, whether it would destroy him or save him, he wanted Alina Vasquez. And Dante Fiore always got what he wanted, no matter the cost. The days that followed their encounter in the library passed like a fever dream, each hour stretching into eternity, while simultaneously racing by in a blur of confusion and want. Dante found himself unable to concentrate on the empire that demanded his constant attention. His mind wandering during board meetings and conference calls to memories of storm-grey eyes and trembling hands, of scars that told stories he desperately wanted to understand. He had built his entire adult life on control, on the ability to compartmentalize emotion and focus solely on the tasks that would expand his power and influence. The Meridian Group required his full attention. There were contracts to negotiate, competitors to outmaneuver, politicians to charm or intimidate as the situation demanded. But for the first time in his professional career, Dante found himself distracted by something that had nothing to do with business. 3 days after their confrontation, he stood in his London penthouse office, 50 floors above the Thames, staring out at the sprawling city that represented his kingdom. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of everything he had conquered. The financial district, where his influence shaped markets, the government buildings where his lobbying efforts had secured favorable legislation, the media outlets where his public relations team carefully crafted his image as the visionary leader of Britain's renewable energy revolution. But all he could think about was a frightened girl with her mother's face and her own unique brand of devastating beauty, cleaning corridors in a Yorkshire manor while carrying secrets that could destroy them both. His assistant, Margaret, had been with him for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs when something was troubling her notoriously focused employer. She had knocked and entered without waiting for permission, carrying a stack of documents that required his signature, and wearing the expression of someone who had questions she was too professional to ask. "The Pemberton situation has been handled," she reported in her crisp, efficient manner. The photographs have been delivered to 3 major newspapers, along with corroborating statements from 4 different women who were willing to go on record about his behavior. His wife has filed for divorce, and his seat on the Energy Committee has been quietly reassigned. He won't be bothering anyone again. Dante nodded absently, his attention still focused on the city spread out below them. Theodore Pemberton's destruction had been swift and thorough, orchestrated with the precision that came from years of understanding exactly which pressure points would cause a man's entire world to collapse. By the time the newspapers finished with him, Pemberton would be lucky to find employment as a clerk in a provincial bank, let alone maintain his position among London's elite. Good, he said, though the satisfaction he usually felt from such complete victories was notably absent. What else? "The Renewable Energy Summit in Edinburgh next month," Margaret continued, consulting her tablet with the efficiency of someone who had made organisation into an art form. "The Prime Minister's office has confirmed his attendance, and the Scottish Parliament has agreed to the preliminary framework for the offshore wind expansion. Your speech is scheduled for the opening ceremony, and the BBC wants an exclusive interview afterwards. Fine, schedule it. The charity gala for the Marcus Fiore Foundation is also next week," Margaret added more quietly, watching his face carefully. "The venue has been confirmed, and we have confirmations from most of the major donors. The auction items have been catalogued, and the final guest list is over 300 people." Dante's jaw tightened at the mention of his brother's foundation, the charitable organization he had established in Marcus's memory to provide scholarships for disadvantaged youth. It was his one concession to sentiment, his attempt to create something positive from the ashes of tragedy, but it also meant spending an evening surrounded by people who would express their sympathy with practiced smiles, while privately speculating about the circumstances of Marcus's death. "Has the venue been secured?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Margaret was nothing if not thorough. "The Royal Opera House, as requested. Security has been coordinated with Williams, and the catering has been arranged through the usual suppliers. However," she hesitated, which was unusual for someone normally so direct. "However what?" "The cleaning service we typically use for such events has had some staffing issues. Williams suggested we might want to bring in additional personnel from Thornfield, people who are already familiar with our security protocols and discretion requirements." Dante turned from the window, his amber eyes focusing on Margaret with laser-like intensity. "Thornfield staff?" "Just temporarily for the event," Margaret clarified quickly, recognizing the dangerous shift in his attention. "Williams mentioned that they have several people who have been thoroughly vetted and are familiar with the level of service we require for high-profile gatherings." "I see." Dante moved to his desk, a massive construction of black marble and steel that dominated one corner of the office. And who specifically did Williams have in mind? Margaret consulted her tablet again, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed personnel list. Mrs. Patterson recommended several of her most trusted staff members, a few of the housekeepers, some catering assistants, and, she paused, someone named Alina Vasquez, who apparently has experience with formal events and has received excellent reviews for her discretion and professionalism. The name hit him like an electric shock, sending currents of anticipation and anxiety racing through his nervous system. Alina. Here in London, in his world, rather than safely tucked away in the isolated Yorkshire countryside, where he could pretend that their encounter had been a momentary aberration. "Interesting," he said, his voice carefully neutral despite the chaos raging in his chest. "And when would this temporary assignment begin?" "Tomorrow, if you approve the arrangements. The staff would travel down from Yorkshire and assist with the preparations leading up to the gala. It would save considerable expense and ensure that everyone involved understands the importance of absolute discretion." Dante stared at the documents on his desk without really seeing them, his mind racing through the implications of having Alina in London, in his territory under his direct supervision. It was dangerous in ways that went far beyond the professional. It was also irresistible in ways that terrified him. "Approve it," he said finally. But I want detailed background checks on everyone involved. No exceptions. Of course, sir. Williams has already begun the process. After Margaret left, Dante found himself unable to focus on anything productive. He tried reviewing contracts, returned phone calls from potential investors, even attempted to read through the latest environmental impact studies for their North Sea projects. But every few minutes, his attention would drift back to the knowledge that in less than 24 hours, Alina would be in London. That evening, he did something he had never done before in his professional life. He cancelled his dinner meeting with the Japanese Energy Consortium and drove back to Thornfield Manor. The excuse he gave Williams was that he needed to personally oversee the security arrangements for the gala staff assignments. But the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The November night was bitter cold, with a wind that cut through even his expensive overcoat as he walked through the manor's corridors. Most of the staff had retired for the evening, leaving the ancient building shrouded in shadows and silence. But Dante knew exactly where to look for the woman who had been haunting his thoughts for 3 days. He found her in the staff quarters, a section of the manor that had been converted into modest but comfortable living spaces for the permanent employees. Through a window he could see her sitting at a small table, writing in what appeared to be a journal by the light of a single lamp. She had changed out of her uniform into simple jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made her dark hair look like silk spilled across her shoulders. For a moment, he simply watched her, noting the way she paused occasionally to touch the pen to her lips in thought, the graceful curve of her neck as she bent over the page, the unconscious elegance of her movements, even when she believed herself unobserved. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that spoke of quiet contentment that he found both beautiful and heartbreaking. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met through the glass. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, caught in a moment of recognition that seemed to stretch across the space between them like a physical connection. Then Alina rose from her chair, moving to the window with the careful grace that characterized all her movements. She opened the window, letting in the cold night air, along with the sound of wind across the moors. "Mr. Fiore," she said quietly, her voice carrying that musical accent that did things to his nervous system he couldn't quite understand. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "I need to speak with you," Dante said, noting how she didn't invite him in, didn't step back from the window to create distance between them. "May I come in?" Alina hesitated, and he could see the war playing out in her storm-grey eyes. Fear and longing, caution and curiosity, all tangled together in a knot that seemed to mirror his own internal conflict. "It's late," she said finally, "and I have an early morning tomorrow. Mrs. Patterson says some of us will be traveling to London for a special assignment." "I know," Dante said. "I approved the assignment. That's what I want to discuss with you." "Oh." Her eyes widened slightly, and he saw understanding dawn across her features. "You knew I would be included. I requested it specifically." The admission was more honest than he had intended, more revealing than was wise. But something about this woman seemed to strip away his usual carefully constructed defenses, leaving him vulnerable in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. Alina stepped back from the window, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to ward off more than just the cold. "Why?" "Because I can't stop thinking about you," Dante said simply. "Because every time I close my eyes, I see yours. Because for the first time in 10 years, I want something more than revenge or power or the cold satisfaction of victory." "That's not a good enough reason," Alina whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "We can't. This can't happen. You know why." "Do I?" Dante leaned against the window frame, close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the cold night air. "Because of who your mother was. Because of what happened to my brother. Because of some curse that says the children must pay for the sins of their parents. Because you're you and I'm me," Alina said, her voice gaining strength even as her body betrayed her by moving closer to the window. "Because you're Dante Fiore, one of the most powerful men in Europe, and I'm a cleaning girl with a criminal for a father and a dead addict for a mother. Because fairy tales don't happen to people like me." "Maybe they do," Dante said, reaching through the window to touch her face, marveling when she didn't pull away. "Maybe the real fairy tale isn't about perfect people living perfect lives. Maybe it's about broken people finding ways to heal each other. I don't know how to heal anyone, Alina whispered, leaning into his touch despite her words. I can barely keep myself together on most days. Then let me help, Dante said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that surprised them both. Let me take care of you the way you should have been taken care of all along. I can't be your project, Alina said, but her resolve was clearly wavering. I can't be the broken bird you fixed to make yourself feel better about your brother's death. The words stung because there was truth in them, but Dante realized that what he felt for her went far deeper than guilt or some misguided attempt at redemption. This wasn't about Marcus, wasn't about the past or the sins of their respective families. This was about the woman standing before him, brave and beautiful and strong in ways she didn't even recognize. You're not a project, he said fiercely. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. Everything I convinced myself I didn't deserve. And what if you're wrong? Alina asked, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some sign that this was real, that she could trust what was happening between them. What if I disappoint you? What if I can't be what you need me to be? Then we'll figure it out together, Dante said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Alina. I'm asking you to be yourself. I'm asking you to give us a chance to see what this could become. For a long moment they stood there in silence, the cold wind whipping around them while they stared into each other's eyes, across a divide that seemed both infinite and negligible. Then Alina stepped back, creating distance that felt like a physical blow. I need to pack, she said quietly. If I'm going to London tomorrow, I need to prepare. Alina, please, she interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. Just please go. This is already complicated enough without making it worse. Dante wanted to argue, wanted to climb through that window and take her in his arms and convince her that what was happening between them was worth any risk, any complication. But he could see the fragility in her eyes, the barely contained panic that suggested she was already operating at the very limits of her emotional capacity. All right, he said finally. But this conversation isn't over. In London, we'll have privacy. We'll have time to talk without the weight of this place, without the ghosts of the past watching everything we do. In London, you'll remember who you are, Alina said sadly, and you'll realize that this was just a moment of madness brought on by isolation and too much whiskey. Will I? Dante stepped back from the window, but his eyes never left her face. So I guess we'll find out. He walked away then, leaving her standing at the window with the cold wind tangling her dark hair and an expression of longing and fear that would haunt his dreams for the rest of the night. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, with clouds hanging low over the Yorkshire moors like a shroud. Dante stood in the main hall of Thornfield Manor, ostensibly overseeing the departure preparations, but actually watching for Alina among the small group of staff members who would be travelling to London. She appeared precisely at the scheduled time, dressed in a simple black coat that made her look even more ethereal than usual, carrying a small suitcase that spoke of someone who owned very little and expected even less. She kept her eyes downcast as Mrs. Patterson conducted a final roll call, checking off names on her clipboard with the efficiency of someone who had been managing household staff for decades. The transportation has been arranged, Mrs. Patterson announced to the assembled group. You'll be staying in the staff quarters at the London house, and your duties will begin immediately upon arrival. Remember that this is a high-profile event, with guests who expect absolute professionalism and discretion. Any infractions will result in immediate dismissal and a permanent black mark on your employment record. Dante watched as Alina nodded along with the others, noting the way she held herself slightly apart from the group, the careful way she avoided drawing attention to herself. It was a survival mechanism, he realized, a way of moving through the world that minimized the chances of being noticed, of being singled out for unwanted attention. Williams approached him as the staff began loading into the waiting vehicles. His expression neutral but his eyes alert. The security briefings have been completed, sir. All personnel have been thoroughly vetted, and additional measures have been put in place for the gala event. Good, Dante said, still watching as Alina climbed into one of the black Range Rovers that would transport the staff to London. I want hourly reports on the preparations. Of course, sir. Will you be returning to London today as well? Shortly, Dante replied. I have some final matters to attend to here first. But that was a lie. The truth was that he needed time to think, to understand what was happening to him and what he intended to do about it. For 10 years, he had lived by rigid rules designed to protect him from the kind of emotional vulnerability that had destroyed his brother. No attachments, no weaknesses, no allowing anyone close enough to cause real damage. Elena Vasquez threatened all of that. She made him want things he had convinced himself were impossible. Made him feel things he had buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. She was dangerous in ways that went far beyond her mother's legacy. Dangerous because she made him want to be a different man than the one he had spent decades becoming. But as he watched the convoy of vehicles disappear down the long drive that led away from Thornfield Manor, Dante realized that danger was no longer something he wanted to avoid. For the first time in his adult life, he wanted to take a risk that had nothing to do with business or politics or the careful expansion of his empire. He wanted to take a risk on love. 3 hours later, he was in his Aston Martin, racing down the M1 toward London, with a speed that would have earned him multiple tickets if any police officer had been brave enough to stop a car with his particular license plates. The November countryside blurred past his windows, but his mind was entirely focused on what awaited him in the city. The London house was a Georgian mansion in Belgravia that had been in the Fiore family for 2 generations, a monument to wealth and power that occupied an entire corner block and commanded views of the exclusive garden squares that made this one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the world. It was here that he entertained heads of state and captains of industry, where he hosted the kind of gatherings that shaped policy and influenced markets. It was also where, in less than 48 hours, he would host the annual gala for the Marcus Fiore Foundation, surrounded by 300 of London's most influential people, while trying to maintain his composure with Elena, somewhere in the same building. He arrived to find the house in a state of controlled chaos, with caterers and florists and security personnel all working with the kind of precision that came from having unlimited resources and absolute expectations of perfection. The staff from Thornfield had been integrated seamlessly into the existing household routine, their Yorkshire efficiency complementing the London staff's urban sophistication. But Dante's attention was focused on finding one particular person among the dozens of people preparing for the gala. He found her in the kitchen, wearing a simple black dress that was obviously part of the catering uniform, but somehow looked elegant on her slender frame. She was arranging flowers in crystal vases, with the same careful attention to detail he had observed in her cleaning work, her movements graceful and precise. "Miss Vasquez," he said quietly, and watched as she looked up with startled storm-grey eyes. "Mr. Fiore," she replied, her voice carefully neutral despite the flush that spread across her cheeks. "I wasn't expecting to see you in the kitchen. I wanted to check on the preparations," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "How are you finding London? Different from Yorkshire?" Elena said, returning her attention to the flowers, as if they required her complete concentration. "Louder. More crowded. More—" She searched for the word. "Overwhelming." "It can be intimidating if you're not used to it," Dante agreed, moving closer under the pretense of examining her work. "But it has its own beauty, its own energy." "I'm sure it does," Elena said, but she didn't sound convinced. "For people who belong here. And you don't think you belong here." She looked up at him then, her grey eyes holding a mixture of sadness and resignation that made his chest tight. "Do you really need to ask that question? Look around you, Mr. Fiore. Look at this house, these preparations, the kind of life you live. Now look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem like someone who belongs in this world?" Dante stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine gold flecks in her grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of her perfume, mixing with the fragrance of the flowers she was arranging. See someone who moves through the world with more grace than half the aristocrats who will be at this gala," he said quietly. "I see someone who has survived things that would have broken most people and somehow managed to retain her compassion, her gentleness, her ability to create beauty out of chaos." "You see what you want to see," Elena whispered, but she didn't move away from him. "You see some fantasy, some ideal that doesn't exist." "No," Dante said, reaching out to touch her face with fingertips that trembled slightly despite his attempts at control. "I see you, the real you, and you're more beautiful than any fantasy I could have imagined." For a moment, they stood there in the middle of the bustling kitchen, surrounded by the preparations for an event that would attract some of the most powerful people in Europe, but existing in a bubble of intimacy that made the rest of the world fade away. Alina's lips parted slightly, and Dante found himself leaning closer, drawn by a magnetism that seemed to defy every rational thought in his head. "Sir?" came a voice from behind them, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Williams stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral but his timing suspiciously perfect. "The security briefing is ready for your review." "Of course," Dante said, stepping back and trying to ignore the way his heart was racing. "Miss Vasquez, please continue with your excellent work." "Yes, sir," Alina replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As Dante left the kitchen, he could feel Williams's questioning gaze following him, but he didn't trust himself to meet the other man's eyes. His head of security was far too perceptive, far too familiar with his employer's moods and motivations. The last thing Dante needed was Williams asking uncomfortable questions about his sudden interest in the Thornfield Manor cleaning staff. But as he made his way through the elegant corridors of his London house, Dante realized that Williams's suspicions were the least of his worries. The real danger wasn't that someone might discover his growing obsession with Alina Vasquez. The real danger was what he might be willing to do to keep her. The night of the Marcus Fiore Foundation Gala arrived with all the pomp and ceremony that London's elite expected from such occasions. The Royal Opera House glittered like a jewel against the November darkness, its neoclassical facade illuminated by spotlights that turned the building into a beacon visible from across Covent Garden. Red carpets cascaded down the steps like rivers of blood, flanked by photographers whose cameras flashed like lightning against the gathering storm of Britain's most powerful people. Dante stood in the VIP reception area, resplendent in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that had been tailored to perfection, his amber eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating these waters since childhood. The Prime Minister was deep in conversation with the Chancellor near the champagne fountain, while captains of industry mingled with hereditary peers and foreign ambassadors in a carefully choreographed dance of power and influence. This was his world, the realm where he moved with absolute confidence and unquestioned authority. Every person in this room either owed him favors, feared his influence, or desperately wanted something from him. The Marcus Fiore Foundation had raised over £50 million in its 10-year existence, funding scholarships for disadvantaged youth across Europe, but tonight it also served as a reminder of the Fiore family's prominence and Dante's position at the apex of British society. Yet despite the familiar comfort of his domain, despite the success of an event that would generate headlines in tomorrow's financial papers, Dante found himself unable to concentrate on anything except the knowledge that somewhere in this building, Alina was working among the catering staff, moving through his world like a ghost from another reality. He had caught glimpses of her throughout the evening preparation, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that emphasized the delicate line of her neck, her slender frame enhanced rather than hidden by the simple black dress that all the female catering staff wore. She moved through the crowds of servers and coordinators with that same careful grace he had observed at Thornfield, making herself indispensable while remaining essentially invisible to the guests who barely acknowledged the people serving them. "Magnificent turnout this year," came a cultured voice from behind him, and Dante turned to find Lord Harrington approaching with a crystal flute of champagne in each hand. Charles Harrington was old-money aristocracy, a man whose family had been powerful when the Fioris were still Italian peasants, but who now found himself financially dependent on the very immigrants his ancestors would have scorned. "The cause is worth supporting," Dante replied, accepting the offered champagne while mentally calculating how much Harrington still owed him from their last business transaction. Marcus would have been pleased to see so many people committed to helping young people overcome the circumstances of their birth. Indeed, Harrington agreed, though his tone suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. "Speaking of circumstances, I couldn't help but notice some rather interesting additions to your catering staff this evening. Where did you find that exquisite Spanish girl?" The one with the remarkable eyes? Every muscle in Dante's body tensed, though years of practice allowed him to maintain his composure. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Charles. The catering has been handled by our usual service providers. Oh, come now, Harrington laughed, the sound carrying an undertone that made Dante's jaw clench. That dark-haired beauty who's been arranging the flower displays. Quite stunning, really. There's something almost exotic about her, don't you think? Very different from the usual English roses one encounters at these affairs. I hadn't noticed, Dante lied smoothly, though internally he was calculating how quickly he could remove Harrington's smug expression from his face without causing a diplomatic incident. Perhaps you should focus on the auction items rather than the staff, Charles. I believe there's a rare Monet that might interest you, assuming your finances have recovered from your recent difficulties. The subtle reminder of Harrington's financial dependence achieved its intended effect, causing the older man's smile to falter slightly. Of course. Though I must say, if you ever decide you don't need such exotic help, I'd be happy to provide alternative employment. A man in my position has many requirements. The implication in Harrington's words sent a wave of cold rage through Dante's system that was so intense he almost forgot where he was. The idea of this bloated aristocrat laying his hands on Alina, of subjecting her to the kind of employment that men like Harrington were notorious for, made him want to commit violence that would make headlines across Europe. I'll keep that in mind, Dante said, his voice carrying enough ice to freeze the Thames. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe my speech is scheduled to begin shortly. He walked away from Harrington before he did something that would require Williams to dispose of a body, but the conversation had left him shaken, in ways that went far beyond professional annoyance. The realization that other men were noticing Alina, that she was drawing attention from predators like Harrington, filled him with a possessiveness that was both primitive and overwhelming. The main auditorium of the Royal Opera House was packed to capacity, with over 300 guests seated in plush red velvet chairs that had witnessed centuries of theatrical performances. The stage had been transformed for the evening, featuring a massive screen displaying photographs of scholarship recipients whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's support, their faces testament to the power of education and opportunity. Dante took the stage to thunderous applause, his commanding presence immediately capturing the attention of every person in the auditorium. He was a natural performer, comfortable with the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, skilled at projecting authority and charisma across vast spaces. 10 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the hall without amplification. This foundation was born from tragedy. My brother Marcus believed that every young person, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, deserved the chance to build a life of meaning and purpose. His death was a reminder that even those born to privilege can find themselves lost in darkness, unable to see a path forward. As he spoke about Marcus, about the importance of providing opportunities for disadvantaged youth, about the Foundation's achievements and future goals, Dante's eyes searched the crowd for any sign of Alina. The catering staff moved like shadows along the walls of the auditorium, ensuring that glasses remained full and needs were anticipated before they were expressed, but he couldn't locate the one person whose presence would make this evening bearable. The young people we support come from backgrounds that would challenge the strongest among us. Dante continued, his voice gaining intensity as he thought about Alina's own story of survival against impossible odds. They have faced poverty, abuse, abandonment, discrimination. They have been told that their dreams are impossible, that people like them don't deserve success or happiness or love. But they prove every day that circumstances don't define destiny. That courage and determination can overcome any obstacle. The applause was enthusiastic, genuine in a way that surprised him. These people, for all their wealth and privilege, seemed genuinely moved by stories of triumph over adversity. Perhaps it was because they recognized on some level that their own comfortable lives were built on foundations that could crumble just as easily as anyone else's. As Dante left the stage, accepting congratulations from board members and major donors, he felt a hand touch his arm lightly. He turned to find Margaret beside him, her expression carrying the kind of professional concern that usually indicated a crisis requiring his immediate attention. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice pitched to carry only to his ears, There's been a situation. Williams needs to speak with you privately, immediately. The cold dread that filled Dante's chest was immediate and consuming. In his world, private emergencies usually involved threats to his business interests, political scandals or security breaches that could destabilize carefully constructed arrangements. But tonight his first thought was of Alina, of something happening to her while she worked invisibly among people who saw her as nothing more than furniture. "Where is he?" Dante asked, already moving toward the exit despite the crowd of people trying to engage him in conversation. "The administrative office. Second floor," Margaret replied, falling into step beside him with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. "He said to tell you it concerns the Thornfield personnel." Dante's stride lengthened, his public mask of calm composure hiding the anxiety that was building in his chest like pressure in a steam engine. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his formal shoes clicking against marble with the precision of a metronome, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from the merely inconvenient to the absolutely catastrophic. He found Williams in a small office that had been commandeered for the evening's security operations, banks of monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the venue. The ex-SAS officer looked grim, his usually impassive features showing signs of genuine concern. "What's happened?" Dante demanded without preamble. "It's Miss Vasquez, sir," Williams said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality that indicated he was walking through a potential minefield. "About an hour ago, she received what appeared to be a distressing phone call. Since then, she's been visibly upset, though she's continued working. 10 minutes ago, she requested permission to step outside for some air. And she's been approached by someone, sir. A man who appears to know her, though not in a pleasant way. They're currently having what looks like a heated conversation in the service alley behind the building." Williams gestured to one of the monitors, and Dante felt his blood turn to ice. The black and white security footage showed Alina pressed against a brick wall, her face pale with fear, while a man in his 40s loomed over her with obvious menace. The man was well dressed, but there was something predatory about his posture, something that spoke of violence barely held in check. "Who is he?" Dante asked, his voice deadly quiet. "We're running facial recognition now, but initial indications suggest his name is Rodriguez. Miguel Rodriguez. He has a criminal record in Spain. Assault, domestic violence, suspected trafficking connections. No current warrants, but he's been a person of interest in several investigations." Her father, Alina, had mentioned him, the man who had abused her and her mother before disappearing from their lives. But why was he here now, tonight, at an event where his presence could only mean trouble? "Sir," Williams continued carefully, "there's something else. We've been monitoring communications, and there's evidence that his appearance here isn't coincidental. Someone provided him with information about Miss Vasquez's employment, her location, the fact that she would be here tonight." The implications hit Dante like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately endangered Alina, had given her abusive father the tools to find her when she thought she was safe. The question was who and why, and what they hoped to gain from orchestrating such a confrontation. "I want him gone," Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had toppled governments and destroyed corporations. "Immediately. Whatever it takes." "Sir, the situation is delicate," Williams said carefully. "If we intervene too aggressively, it could draw unwanted attention. The media presence outside is substantial, and any disturbance—" "I don't care about the media," Dante snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I don't care about discretion or public relations or any of the usual considerations. I want that man away from her, and I want it done now." Williams nodded, recognizing the futility of arguing when his employer was in this state. "Understood, sir. However, I should mention that Miss Vasquez appears to be handling the situation herself. She's been trying to convince him to leave voluntarily." On the monitor, Dante could see Alina gesturing emphatically, her mouth moving in what appeared to be urgent conversation. But Rodriguez wasn't backing down, his posture becoming more aggressive, his hands moving in ways that suggested the conversation was escalating toward violence. "That's enough," Dante said, moving toward the door with purposeful strides. "I'm going down there myself." "Sir, that's not advisable," Williams said, but he was already following, recognizing that his employer was beyond reasoning. "If you're seen in a confrontation with this man, it could compromise your position. Let me handle it with the security team. But Dante was already moving through the corridors of the Royal Opera House with the focused intensity of a predator stalking prey. The elegant surroundings, the cultural sophistication, the civilized veneer of the evening's activities, all of it fell away, leaving only the primitive need to protect what was his. The service alley was a stark contrast to the glamour inside the building, narrow and dimly lit, with industrial dumpsters and service vehicles creating shadows that could hide any number of threats. Dante approached from the rear entrance, his formal shoes silent on the wet pavement, his expensive tuxedo incongruous in the gritty urban setting. "You think you can just disappear?" Rodriguez was saying, his accented English thick with alcohol and rage. "You think you can hide from me forever, little girl? I know what you are, what your mother was. Whores, both of you. And whores don't get to choose who uses them. I don't want anything from you," Alina replied, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her posture. "I just want you to leave me alone. I've built a life for myself, a good life. I don't need you in it." "A good life?" Rodriguez laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the brick walls like broken glass. "Cleaning toilets for rich people? Scrubbing floors like your mother did? You're nothing, Nina. You'll always be nothing. But I can change that. I have friends, connections, people who pay well for young girls who know how to keep their mouths shut." The implications of his words sent a wave of rage through Dante that was so intense he could barely see straight. This piece of human garbage was not only threatening Alina, he was suggesting trafficking, prostitution, a fate worse than anything she had already endured. "She's not available," Dante said quietly, stepping out of the shadows with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. Both Alina and Rodriguez spun toward him, their faces registering shock for very different reasons. Alina's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been relief, while Rodriguez's expression shifted to calculation as he took in Dante's obvious wealth and power. "Mr. Fiore," Alina whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and mortification, "you shouldn't be here. This isn't your concern, isn't it?" Dante moved closer, his amber eyes never leaving Rodriguez's face. "Someone is threatening one of my employees, disturbing the peace of an important charitable event, and suggesting criminal activities that could reflect poorly on my organization. I'd say that makes it very much my concern." Rodriguez straightened, trying to project confidence despite being clearly outmatched by the man in front of him. "This is family business, senor. Private matters that don't concern outsiders. Family," Dante laughed, the sound carrying no warmth whatsoever. "From what I understand, you forfeited any claim to that title when you chose to abuse your wife and daughter before abandoning them to fend for themselves. That makes you less than family. That makes you nothing." "You don't know what you're talking about," Rodriguez said, but his bravado was clearly forced. "Alina belongs with her people, not serving English masters who will use her and throw her away." "And what would you do with her?" Dante asked, stepping close enough that Rodriguez had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. "Sell her to your friends. Force her into the same life that killed her mother. Is that the future you're offering? Better than being a cleaning girl," Rodriguez muttered, but he was clearly reconsidering his position as he took in Dante's size, his obvious fitness, the controlled violence that radiated from every line of his body. "Actually," Dante said conversationally, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Vasquez isn't a cleaning girl. She's my personal assistant, a position that comes with certain cheap protections, including protection from unwanted family members who might disturb her peace of mind." The lie came so smoothly that even Williams, who had appeared at the mouth of the alley with 2 other security personnel, didn't react. But Dante could see the impact it had on both Alina and Rodriguez for very different reasons. "Your assistant?" Rodriguez looked between them, clearly trying to assess whether this development changed his calculations. "And what exactly does that involve?" "Nothing that's any of your business," Dante replied smoothly, "but it does mean that Miss Vasquez is under my protection, both professionally and personally, which means that anyone who threatens her is threatening me. And I'm not as forgiving as she is." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that came from having the power to destroy lives with a phone call. Rodriguez was clearly weighing his options, looking for an angle that might still work in his favor. "How much?" he asked finally, his true nature revealing itself with ugly clarity. If she's so valuable to you, how much is she worth? Everyone has a price, senor. Even English millionaires. The words hung in the air like poison gas, toxic in their casual assumption that Alina was property to be bought and sold. Dante felt something snap inside his chest, some last restraint that had been holding back the full force of his rage. "Williams," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Rodriguez. "Sir, I want this man escorted off the premises. If he returns, if he attempts to contact Miss Vasquez again, if he so much as breathes in her direction, I want him to understand that there will be consequences. The kind of consequences that men like him don't recover from." "Understood, sir." "And Williams, make sure he understands that his immigration status in this country is entirely dependent on my continued goodwill. A phone call to the Home Office about suspected criminal activities could make life very uncomfortable for someone in his position." Rodriguez's face paled as the implications sank in. Whatever game he had thought he was playing, whatever easy money he had imagined extracting from this situation, he was clearly beginning to understand that he had miscalculated badly. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, that is," Dante replied with absolute finality. "If you're smart, you'll disappear back to whatever hole you crawled out of and forget you ever had a daughter. Because if you don't, if you make the mistake of bothering her again, you'll discover just how unforgiving the world can be to men who hurt women." Williams and his team moved in then, professional and efficient, surrounding Rodriguez in a way that made any further resistance pointless. Within minutes they had escorted him out of the alley and toward a waiting vehicle that would take him far away from the Royal Opera House and from Alina. Dante and Alina stood alone in the narrow space, the sounds of the city fading around them as they stared at each other across a divide that seemed both infinite and negligible. She was shaking, whether from cold or shock or residual fear he couldn't tell, but her storm-grey eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of traffic and celebration. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to get involved." "Yes, I did," Dante said simply, moving closer, until he could see the fine gold flecks in her eyes, until he could smell the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the crisp November air. "I couldn't let him hurt you, but your reputation, your position, if anyone had seen you out here, if the media had noticed—" "I don't care about any of that," Dante interrupted, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had just threatened. "Do you understand? I don't care about my reputation or my position or what anyone thinks. I only care about you." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fraught with danger and possibility in equal measure. Alina's breath caught in her throat, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some sign that this was real, that she could trust what was happening between them. "Dante," she whispered, and the sound of his name on her lips was like music, like absolution, like everything he had been searching for without knowing it. He kissed her then, there in the shadowy alley behind one of London's most prestigious venues, with the sounds of high society celebrating mere yards away. It was a kiss that spoke of possession and protection, of want and need and the kind of desperate hunger that came from years of emotional starvation. Alina melted into him, her hands fisting in the expensive fabric of his tuxedo, as if she could anchor herself to this moment, to this feeling of being wanted and protected and cherished. She tasted like champagne and hope, and something uniquely her own that made his head spin with possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "No one will ever hurt you again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear it, Alina. As long as I'm alive, no one will ever make you afraid again." It was a vow that would cost him everything he had built, challenge everything he believed about himself, and ultimately prove that some things were worth more than power, more than safety, more than the careful walls he had constructed around his heart. But in that moment, with Alina in his arms and the taste of her kiss still on his lips, Dante Fiori finally understood what his brother had been willing to die for. Love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any consequence. And he was ready to prove it. The days following the gala passed in a haze of stolen moments and mounting tension that seemed to electrify the very air between them. Dante had insisted that Alina remain in London, ostensibly to assist with the Foundation's post-event activities, but they both knew the real reason. The kiss in the alley had changed everything, had torn down walls that both of them had spent years building, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in ways that were both terrifying and exhilarating. The London house had become a different place entirely, with her presence infusing every corner. Where once the Georgian mansion had felt like a beautiful mausoleum, cold and perfect and lifeless, now it hummed with an energy that Dante had never experienced. He would find himself pausing in corridors where her laughter had echoed, lingering in rooms where she had worked, breathing in the faint traces of her perfume that seemed to cling to the very walls. She moved through his world with increasing confidence, no longer the frightened girl hiding in shadows, but a woman discovering her own power. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the way she held her shoulders straighter, the way she met his gaze directly, the way she spoke with growing assurance about topics that had once intimidated her. It was as if his protection, his declaration in that alley, had given her permission to become the person she had always been beneath the layers of trauma and survival. But with that transformation came complications that neither of them had anticipated. Dante stood in his private study on the 3rd floor of the London house, staring out at the manicured gardens of Belgravia while holding a phone conversation that was testing every limit of his patience. On the other end of the line, his Aunt Viviana was delivering what she clearly considered devastating news with the dramatic flair that had made her famous in Milan's social circles. "The photographs are everywhere. Dante," she was saying, her Italian accent thick with disapproval and barely concealed excitement. "Every major newspaper in Europe has them. You looking like some romantic hero, rescuing a mysterious Spanish girl in an alley behind the Royal Opera House. The speculation is absolutely wild." Dante closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family obligation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had known this moment would come, had understood that their kiss wouldn't remain private for long, in a world where privacy was a luxury that even billionaires couldn't always afford. "What kind of speculation?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Everything imaginable," Viviana replied with the relish of someone who thrived on scandal. "Some papers are calling her your secret mistress. Others are suggesting she's a Spanish aristocrat fleeing some romantic tragedy. The more sensational publications are hinting at everything from international espionage to organized crime connections. And of course, everyone wants to know who she is and how long you've been keeping her hidden." "She's not hidden," Dante said carefully. "She's a member of my staff who was being harassed by an unstable individual. I intervened as any employer would." "Oh, please," Viviana laughed, the sound carrying decades of experience in reading between the lines of society scandals. "So I've seen the photographs, Caro. The way you're looking at her, the way you're holding her. That's not how a man looks at his employee. That's how a man looks at a woman he wants to possess completely." The accuracy of her observation was unsettling, but Dante had learned long ago not to reveal weakness to family members who would use it against him. "My personal life is not up for discussion, Viviana. It is when it affects the family," she shot back, her tone shifting from playful to serious. "Do you have any idea what this means for the negotiations with the Rothschild consortium? What it does to your carefully cultivated image as Europe's most eligible bachelor? The board members are already asking questions. Dante, they want to know if you're planning to marry this girl, and if so, what her background investigation revealed." "The board can go to hell," Dante said quietly, but his aunt caught the dangerous edge in his voice. "This isn't just about you anymore." Viviana continued, ignoring his warning tone. "The family has obligations, commitments, that depend on your reputation remaining intact. Your grandfather's foundation, the charitable trusts, the political connections, all of it requires a certain level of social standing that could be compromised by an unsuitable association." "Unsuitable?" Dante repeated, tasting the word like poison. "And what exactly makes her unsuitable, Viviana? Her lack of a title? Her honest work? The fact that she's survived things that would have destroyed most of the pampered princesses you keep trying to introduce me to?" "Her mother," Viviana said simply, and Dante felt his blood turn to ice. We know who she is, Dante. Elena Vasquez's daughter, the woman who destroyed Marcus, who nearly brought scandal down on our entire family. Do you really think we wouldn't investigate? Do you think we'd allow you to repeat the same mistakes that cost us so much? The silence that followed was deafening, filled with implications and threats that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Dante had known this moment would come, had understood that his family's intelligence network would eventually identify Elena and connect her to their past tragedy. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the cold calculation in his aunt's voice, made him realize how far he had already traveled down a path that led away from everything his family represented. "So what are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "End it," Viviana said bluntly, quietly, professionally, with enough financial compensation to ensure her silence and gratitude. Find her a position somewhere far from London, somewhere she can build a new life, without dragging our family through another Elena Vasquez scandal. It's the kindest solution for everyone involved. Kindest for whom? Dante asked, his voice carrying a warning that his aunt chose to ignore. For her, obviously. Do you think she can survive in our world? Do you think she has any idea what it means to be scrutinized by the international media, to have every detail of her past dissected by people looking for ammunition? She's a cleaning girl, Dante. A beautiful, tragic cleaning girl with a devastating family history. She deserves better than being destroyed by association with us. She deserves better than being dismissed by people who've never bothered to know her, Dante replied, but even as he spoke the words, he could feel doubt creeping into his chest like poison. Was Viviana right? Was he being selfish, dragging Elena into a world that would ultimately destroy her? He had seen what the media attention could do to people, had watched politicians and business leaders crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. What would it do to someone as vulnerable as Elena, someone who had already survived so much trauma? Think about it, Viviana said, her tone softening slightly. Think about what you're really offering her. A life of constant judgment, of never being good enough, of always being seen as the Spanish girl who trapped the great Dante Fiori. Is that really love, Caro? Or is it just another form of cruelty? The call ended, leaving Dante alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of dread that his aunt's words contained more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. He moved to the window, looking down at the garden where Elena was reading beneath an ancient oak tree, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight like silk spun from shadows. She looked peaceful, content in a way that he had rarely seen since their first meeting. The constant tension that had characterized her movements at Thornfield was gone, replaced by something that resembled actual happiness. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction, with the knowledge that his protection was allowing her to flourish. Instead, it filled him with a crushing sense of responsibility that felt heavier than all his business obligations combined. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his brooding, and Williams entered with the silent efficiency that characterized all his movements. The ex-SAS officer's expression was carefully neutral, but Dante had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his head of security was troubled about something. "Sir," Williams said, closing the door behind him and activating the electronic privacy shield that would prevent their conversation from being overheard by any surveillance equipment. "We need to discuss the Rodriguez situation." "What about it?" Dante asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He's been making inquiries," Williams replied, consulting a tablet that contained information Dante was certain he didn't want to hear. "Reaching out to certain unsavory contacts, asking questions about Miss Vasquez's current situation, her value to you, potential leverage opportunities." "Leverage?" "He's not working alone, sir. Our investigation has revealed that his sudden appearance at the gala was coordinated by someone with significant resources and detailed knowledge of your security arrangements. Someone who knew exactly when and where Miss Vasquez would be vulnerable." The implications hit Dante like a physical blow. Rodriguez hadn't simply stumbled across Elena by chance. He had been directed to her, guided by someone who understood enough about the Fiori family dynamics to know that she represented a potential weakness. "Who?" Dante asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "We are still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests involvement from the Castellano organization," Williams said, and Dante felt his blood pressure spike dangerously. "They've been probing for weaknesses in your operations for months, looking for ways to disrupt the renewable energy contracts that are cutting into their traditional fossil fuel investments. Lorenzo Castellano was old-world organized crime, masquerading as legitimate business. A man whose family had been feuding with the Fioris for 3 generations over energy sector dominance in southern Europe. He was also smart enough to understand that the most effective way to destroy a man like Dante wasn't through business competition or physical violence, but through emotional manipulation. "They're using her as bait," Dante said, the realization settling in his stomach like acid. "It appears so, sir. The plan seems to be to create a scandal that will damage your reputation while simultaneously providing them with leverage over your personal life. Miss Vasquez becomes either a weapon they can use against you or a vulnerability they can exploit. And Rodriguez, a convenient tool. A man with legitimate grievances and criminal connections who can be directed towards specific targets while maintaining plausible deniability for whoever's pulling his strings." Dante moved to his desk, sinking into the leather chair that had belonged to his grandfather, feeling the weight of generations of Fiori responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every decision he made now would have consequences that rippled far beyond his personal happiness, affecting not just his own future, but the lives of thousands of people who depended on his business empire for their livelihoods. "Options?" he asked. "Several," Williams replied, his tone carefully neutral. "We can eliminate Rodriguez permanently, though that carries obvious risks. We can relocate Miss Vasquez somewhere the Castellanos can't reach her, though that would require her cooperation and might not provide long-term security. Or, we can end her involvement in your life completely. Remove the leverage by removing the relationship. It's the cleanest solution from a security standpoint." The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence, logical and practical and absolutely devastating. Williams was right. The safest course of action for everyone involved would be to send Alina away, to end whatever was growing between them, before it could be used as a weapon against either of them. But the thought of losing her, of returning to the empty existence he had lived before she entered his world, was more terrifying than any business rival or criminal organization. "There's another option," Dante said slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or completely insane. "We give them exactly what they want. Sir, Faust, they want a scandal. They want leverage. They want to see me make emotional decisions that compromise my business judgment." Dante stood, moving to the window where he could see Alina still reading in the garden, oblivious to the forces gathering around her. "So we give them exactly that. We make our relationship public, official, impossible to use as leverage because there's nothing hidden to expose." Williams was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of such a strategy. "That would be unprecedented, sir. The media attention would be intense. The scrutiny of Miss Vasquez's background, her family history, the connection to your brother's death, it would all become public knowledge." "Yes, it would." Dante turned back to his security chief, his amber eyes holding a determination that surprised them both. "But it would also make her untouchable. Once she's publicly under my protection, once our relationship is official and acknowledged, any move against her becomes a move against me directly. The Castellanos are ruthless, but they're not stupid enough to declare open war on the Fiori family. And Miss Vasquez? Does she understand what such exposure would mean for her? The loss of privacy, the constant scrutiny, the pressure of being associated with your public image. It was the question Dante had been avoiding, the consideration that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully in the guest room down the hall. Did Alina truly understand what she was getting into? Did she realize that loving him meant accepting a life where every action would be judged, every word analyzed, every moment of happiness paid, for with a corresponding loss of freedom? "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think she deserves the chance to make that choice for herself. And if she chooses to walk away..." The question hit him like a physical blow, but Dante forced himself to consider it seriously. If Alina decided that the price of loving him was too high, if she chose safety and anonymity over the dangerous glamour of his world, would he have the strength to let her go? "Then I'll make sure she has everything she needs to build a life somewhere safe," he said finally. "But I won't make that choice for her. I won't decide what she can or can't handle based on my own fears. Williams nodded, accepting the decision even as his expression suggested he thought it was potentially catastrophic. Shall I begin making arrangements for enhanced security? If you're going public with the relationship, we'll need to assume that threats against Miss Vasquez will escalate significantly. Do whatever's necessary, Dante said. But Williams? Make sure the security is invisible. She spent her entire life feeling trapped, controlled, powerless. I won't let protecting her become another form of prison. After Williams left, Dante remained in his study for nearly an hour, staring out at the garden where Alina had abandoned her book in favor of feeding the ornamental fish in the small pond. She moved with unconscious grace, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of watching the coy surface for the breadcrumbs she scattered across the water. She looked happy, peaceful, safe. And he was about to destroy all of that by dragging her into a world that would scrutinize every detail of her existence, judge every aspect of her worth, and ultimately decide whether she was good enough to love a man like him. But the alternative, losing her to forces beyond their control, watching her disappear to avoid a scandal that would follow her anyway, was unthinkable. At least this way, she would have his protection, his resources, his absolute commitment to keeping her safe, no matter what storms their relationship might weather. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made him straighten, schooling his features into the neutral expression that had served him well in countless business negotiations. But when Alina knocked softly and entered the study, her storm-grey eyes immediately went to his face with the kind of perception that suggested she could read his moods better than he'd realized. "You look like someone who's received very bad news," she said, closing the door behind her and moving to where he stood by the window. "What's happened?" "Nothing that can't be handled," Dante replied, but even as he spoke the words, he could see that she didn't believe them. "Don't," Alina said quietly, reaching out to touch his arm with fingers that were steady despite everything she had been through. "Don't protect me from the truth. I've spent my entire life being protected from things people thought I couldn't handle, and it never made me safer. It just made me ignorant." The simple honesty of her words hit him harder than all of Viviana's threats or William's security briefings. Here was a woman who had survived horrors that would have destroyed most people, who had faced down her abusive father just days ago with more courage than most people ever displayed, asking him to trust her with the truth about their situation. "The family knows about us," he said finally, "about the photographs from the gala, about your mother, about everything. They want me to end our relationship before it causes problems for the business." Alina absorbed this information without flinching, though he could see the pain that flickered across her features before she suppressed it. "And what do you want?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all the complexity and political maneuvering to the heart of what really mattered. What did he want? What was he willing to sacrifice, to risk, to fight for? "I want you," Dante said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you're safe and happy. I want to fall asleep every night with you in my arms. I want to build something real with you, something that isn't based on duty or obligation or family expectations. Even if it costs you everything else? Everything else is meaningless without you." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fraught with danger and possibility in equal measure. Alina's eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of doubt or reservation, some indication that he didn't fully understand what he was saying. "The media attention will be intense," she said slowly, clearly thinking through the implications. "Every detail of my past will become public knowledge. The things my father did, my mother's relationship with your brother, the circumstances of my childhood, it will all be dissected and analyzed and judged. I know. People will say terrible things about me, about you for choosing me, about what that says about your judgment, your character, your fitness to lead your company. Let them." "Dante." Alina moved closer, her hands coming up to frame his face with a tenderness that nearly undid his carefully maintained composure. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once we cross this line, once we make this public, there's no going back. We'll both have to live with the consequences for the rest of our lives." He covered her hands with his own, marveling at how small and delicate they felt against his scarred fingers. These hands had scrubbed floors and washed dishes, and performed 1,000 menial tasks that kept her alive, when no one else cared whether she lived or died. But they had also touched him with more genuine affection than he had ever experienced from any of the women his family considered suitable. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, and realized as he spoke the words that they were absolutely true. "I love you, Alina, not because you're convenient or appropriate or what my family expects. I love you because you're brave and kind and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with your appearance. I love you because you make me want to be better than I am." Tears gathered in her storm-gray eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise, that made his chest tight with emotions he was only beginning to understand. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "God help us both. I love you too." It was a declaration of war against the forces that would try to tear them apart, a promise to stand together against whatever storms their love might weather. And as Dante held her in his arms, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, he knew that no matter what happened next, he had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth living for, something worth dying for, if necessary. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering over London, dark and ominous against the grey November sky. But inside the study, surrounded by centuries of Fiore history and tradition, two people who should never have found each other were planning a future that would challenge everything their respective worlds believed about love, power, and the price of happiness. The war for their love was about to begin, and Dante Fiore had never lost a war yet. The announcement came on a Tuesday, morning that would forever divide Dante's life into before and after. He had chosen the Times for the exclusive interview, understanding that the venerable newspaper's reputation for serious journalism would lend gravitas to what many would undoubtedly view as a scandal. The photograph accompanying the article was stunning in its simplicity. Dante and Alina walking hand in hand through the gardens of his Belgravia house, her dark hair catching the morning light, his protective posture unmistakable even in the formal composition. The headline read, "Energy magnate Dante Fiore confirms romance with Spanish heritage coordinator Alina Vasquez," but the subtext was clear to anyone who understood the coded language of British society journalism. Here was one of Europe's most powerful men, a billionaire whose personal life had been the subject of speculation for years, publicly claiming a woman whose background would have disqualified her from consideration in any traditional aristocratic circles. Within hours, the story had exploded across every major media outlet in Europe and beyond. The photograph was reproduced endlessly, analyzed by body language experts and society commentators, dissected for clues about the nature of their relationship and its implications for the Fiore business empire. Alina's transformation from anonymous cleaning staff to the woman who had captured Dante Fiore's heart became an instant international sensation. But it was the details that made the story truly compelling. The revelation that she was the daughter of Elena Vasquez, the dancer whose affair with Marcus Fiore had ended in tragedy. The mysterious circumstances surrounding her employment at Thornfield Manor. The dramatic confrontation at the Royal Opera House that had first brought them to public attention. The media painted it as a love story worthy of Shakespeare, complete with family curses, star-crossed lovers, and the redemptive power of true love overcoming past sins. Dante stood in his office, watching the BBC's coverage of their announcement, while simultaneously fielding calls from board members, family representatives, and political allies who wanted to understand what his personal revelation meant for their various relationships with the Fiore empire. The response was exactly what he had expected, a mixture of shock, calculation, and barely concealed disapproval from those who viewed his choice as either a romantic gesture or a spectacular lapse in judgment. "The Prime Minister's office has called 3 times," Margaret reported as she entered, with yet another stack of messages and interview requests. "They're concerned about how this might affect the renewable energy legislation currently before Parliament. Apparently, some of the more conservative MPs are questioning whether a man whose judgment in personal matters is so questionable should be trusted with billions in government contracts." "Let them question," Dante replied, his attention focused on the television screen, where a panel of experts was debating the implications of his announcement. My personal life has nothing to do with my ability to deliver clean energy solutions to this country. The Castellano organization has also responded, Margaret continued more quietly. Their London representative issued a statement congratulating you on your happiness and expressing hope that your new personal commitments won't interfere with your business obligations. The veiled threat in the message was unmistakable, but Dante found himself oddly calm about it. By making his relationship with Alina public, he had removed their primary weapon, the ability to use her as leverage through threats and manipulation. Now she was under the protection of public attention as well as private security, making any move against her a direct challenge to his authority. "And the family?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Your grandfather has requested a meeting at the earliest possible convenience," Margaret said diplomatically. "Your Aunt Viviana has been less diplomatic in her communications." Before Dante could respond, his phone buzzed with a call from the one person whose opinion mattered more than all the politicians and board members combined. Alina's name appeared on the screen, and he answered immediately, stepping away from Margaret to ensure privacy. "How are you holding up?" he asked without preamble. "Like I'm living in someone else's life," Alina replied, and he could hear the strain in her voice despite her attempt to sound composed. "There are photographers outside the house. Mrs. Chen counted 17 news vans on the street this morning. Williams has assigned 2 security guards just to accompany me to the corner shop." "I'm sorry," Dante said, and meant it. "I knew it would be intense, but this is beyond what even I expected." "It's not your fault," Alina said quietly. "We both knew this would happen. It's just overwhelming. The things they're saying about me, about my mother, about what this means for your reputation. I'm starting to wonder if everyone was right about this being a mistake." The doubt in her voice hit him harder than any family disapproval or media criticism. He had expected external opposition, but the possibility that Alina herself might be having second thoughts about their relationship was something he wasn't prepared to face. "What specifically are they saying?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "That I'm a gold digger who seduced you to escape poverty. That I'm using my mother's connection to your family to manipulate you into repeating your brother's mistakes. That I'm not educated enough, sophisticated enough, or worthy enough to be with someone of your stature." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. "Maybe they're right, Dante. Maybe I am just a cleaning girl who got in over her head." "Stop," Dante said sharply, his voice cutting through her self-doubt like a blade. "Listen to me, Alina. You are not what they say you are. You are not your mother's mistakes or your father's cruelty or some tabloid's idea of who deserves love. You are the strongest, most courageous person I've ever known, and anyone who can't see that is blind to what really matters. But what if this destroys everything you've built? What if loving me costs you your empire, your family, your position in the world? Then I'll build something new," Dante said without hesitation. "Something better. Something that's ours instead of something inherited from people who never understood what it means to love someone. More than power." The silence that followed was filled with all the weight of their impossible situation, but also with something else, a determination that had been growing stronger with each challenge they faced together. "I love you," Alina said finally, her voice steady again. "Whatever happens, whatever they say about us, I want you to know that I love you completely. Not your money or your status or your influence, just you. The man who protected me when no one else cared, who saw something worth saving in a broken girl with a terrible family history." "You were never broken," Dante said fiercely. "You were just waiting for someone to recognize how extraordinary you are." Their conversation was interrupted by Williams appearing in the doorway, his expression carrying the kind of urgency that usually preceded very bad news. Dante gestured for him to wait while he finished the call. "I have to go," he told Alina, "but this isn't over. We're going to face whatever comes next together, and we're going to prove that love is stronger than fear." "I hope you're right," she said softly. "I really hope you're right." After ending the call, Dante turned his full attention to Williams, who was consulting his tablet with the grim efficiency that characterized all his briefings during crisis situations. "What's happened?" Dante asked. We've intercepted communications suggesting that the media attention has accelerated the Castellano timeline, Williams reported. They're no longer content to use Miss Vasquez as leverage. Now they're treating the situation as an opportunity to destroy your credibility entirely. Meaning? They're planning to release information that will make the current media coverage look tame by comparison. Detailed allegations about Miss Vasquez's background, fabricated evidence of criminal connections, manufactured scandals designed to suggest that your relationship is part of some elaborate criminal conspiracy. Dante felt his blood pressure spike as he processed the implications. What kind of information? Forged documents suggesting that Miss Vasquez has been working with Rodriguez to infiltrate your organization. Bank records showing mysterious payments that could be interpreted as either blackmail or bribery. Photographs that appear to show her in compromising situations with known criminals. All fabricated, almost certainly, but sophisticated enough to pass initial scrutiny. By the time independent verification proves the documents are false, the damage to both your reputations will be irreversible. Dante moved to the window, looking out at the London skyline that represented his kingdom, his empire, everything he had spent his adult life building. The city sprawled before him like a vast chessboard, and he was beginning to understand that the Castellanos were several moves ahead in a game he hadn't realized he was playing. Timeline? He asked. Our sources suggest they plan to release everything within 72 hours, probably timed to coincide with the weekend news cycle, when fact-checking is minimal and sensational stories get maximum exposure. Options. Williams was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing different scenarios in his mind. We could go public with our knowledge of the Castellano involvement, but that would require revealing intelligence sources that we might need for future operations. We could attempt to discredit the information before it's released, but that draws attention to allegations that might otherwise be ignored. Or? We could give them something they want more than your destruction. Dante turned from the window, his amber eyes focusing on his security chief with laser-like intensity. Such as? The Castellanos have been trying to gain access to the North Sea energy fields for years. Their traditional fossil fuel investments are becoming increasingly worthless as renewable energy dominates the market. If we were to offer them a legitimate partnership in one of the smaller offshore projects, it might satisfy their need for diversification while removing their motivation for destroying you. You're suggesting I negotiate with terrorists, Dante said quietly. I'm suggesting you consider whether protecting Miss Vasquez and preserving your relationship is worth a strategic compromise that doesn't actually cost you anything significant. It was a rational suggestion, the kind of calculated political maneuvering that had allowed the Fiori family to thrive for 3 generations. Give your enemies something they value more than victory, and they'll often choose profit over principle. But the idea of rewarding the Castellanos for their threats, of allowing them to benefit from their attempts to destroy his happiness, was repugnant on a level that transcended business logic. No, Dante said finally, I don't negotiate with people who threaten the woman I love. We find another way. Sir, with respect, your emotional attachment to Miss Vasquez may be clouding your judgment about what's best for everyone involved, including her. The words hit Dante like a physical blow, not because they were meant to be cruel, but because they echoed his own deepest fears about the situation. Was he being selfish? Was his need to protect Alina actually putting her in more danger? Would she be safer if he walked away, if he chose the logical path over the emotional one? Before he could respond, his phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed his grandfather's name, and Dante knew that the conversation he had been dreading was about to begin. Nonno, he answered, using the Italian term of endearment from his childhood. Dante, came the voice of Alessandro Fiori, patriarch of the family, and the man who had built their empire from nothing. Even at 87, his grandfather's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. We need to talk immediately. I'm listening. Not on the phone. Come to the estate. Bring the girl. The line went dead, leaving Dante staring at his phone with a mixture of dread and resignation. A summons from Alessandro Fiori was not a request. It was a command that had shaped the destiny of 3 generations of their family. And now Alina would be subjected to the judgment of a man who had never lost a battle, never shown mercy to those he considered enemies, and never forgiven weakness in anyone who bore the Fiore name. 2 hours later, Dante and Alina were driving through the Surrey countryside toward the ancestral Fiore estate, a Georgian mansion that had been the family seat for 60 years. The November landscape was bleak and windswept, matching the mood inside the Aston Martin as they approached what felt increasingly like a trial that would determine the fate of their relationship. Alina sat beside him in elegant silence, wearing a simple black dress that he had chosen specifically to project dignity and respectability. She had insisted on coming, despite his attempts to shield her from what was likely to be an ordeal, pointing out that any decisions about their future should involve both of them, rather than being made for her by men who had never bothered to know who she really was. "Tell me about him," she said as they turned into the long drive that led to the main house. "Your grandfather, what should I expect?" "He's old-world Italian in every sense," Dante replied, slowing the car to give them more time to talk. "He believes in tradition, hierarchy, family honor above individual happiness. He built our fortune from nothing, survived 2 world wars, outlasted dozens of business rivals who tried to destroy him. He's never met a problem he couldn't solve through either negotiation or force. And he disapproves of me. He disapproves of anything that threatens family stability. It's not personal. He would react the same way to any relationship that complicated his carefully laid plans for the family's future." Which were? Dante was quiet for a moment, realizing that he had never fully explained to Alina just how drastically their relationship had disrupted his family's expectations. Marriage to someone from an established family, preferably European aristocracy, with business connections that would expand our influence. Children who would be raised to understand their obligations to the family legacy. A life that prioritized duty over personal satisfaction. "And instead you chose me," Alina said softly, "a cleaning girl with a criminal father and a dead addict mother. Someone whose very existence reminds your family of their greatest scandal." "I chose the woman I love," Dante corrected firmly. "Everything else is just details that other people think matter more than they actually do." The estate house appeared ahead of them, its classical facade imposing against the grey sky. Dante could see several vehicles parked in the circular drive, indicating that this would not be a private family meeting, but rather a formal assembly of the Fiore power structure. "Dante," Alina said as they approached the front entrance, her voice carrying a note of finality that made his chest tighten with apprehension. "Before we go in there, I need you to promise me something. Anything. If this becomes a choice between me and your family, between our love and everything you've worked to build, I want you to choose what's best for you. Not what you think you owe me, not what feels romantic or noble, but what will actually make you happy in the long run." "You make me happy," Dante said without hesitation. "You make me feel alive in ways I had forgotten were possible. Whatever happens in there, whatever they say or threaten or demand, that's not going to change. Promise me you'll at least listen to them," Alina insisted. "Promise me you'll consider the possibility that loving me might not be worth the price you'll have to pay." Dante stopped the car and turned to face her fully, his amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've spent my entire adult life making careful, calculated decisions based on what other people thought was best for me. I've chosen duty over desire, obligation over happiness, family expectations over personal fulfillment, and it left me empty, Alina. It left me living in a beautiful prison of other people's design." He reached out to take her hands, marveling at how steady they were despite everything they were about to face. "You didn't just give me love. You gave me life. You gave me the courage to want something more than the cold satisfaction of power and influence. So no, I won't promise to choose between you and my family, because there is no choice. There's only you and everything else that used to matter but doesn't anymore." Alina leaned forward and kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of the kind of desperate love that people feel when they know they're about to face something that could destroy everything they've built together. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "No matter what happens in there, no matter what they say or do or threaten, I love you completely." "Then that's all we need," Dante said, though even as he spoke the words, he could feel the weight of 3 generations of Fiore expectations pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They walked toward the house hand in hand, Two people who had found each other against impossible odds, about to face the judgment of a family that had never learned to value love over power. The November wind whipped around them, cold and bitter, but neither of them let go of the other's hand. Inside the mansion, Alessandro Fiori waited with the patience of a man who had never doubted his ability to bend the world to his will. And somewhere in London, the Castellano organization was preparing to unleash a media assault that would test whether love really could survive the kind of coordinated destruction that money and influence could buy. The final battle for their future was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just whether Dante and Alina could build a life together, but whether love itself was strong enough to overcome the forces that profited from keeping people afraid, isolated, and alone. As they reached the front door of the Fiori estate, Dante felt a moment of absolute clarity about what mattered most in life. It wasn't the empire his family had built, or the power that came with the Fiori name, or the carefully constructed image that had made him one of Europe's most influential men. It was the woman whose hand was steady in his, whose love had taught him that some things were worth risking everything to protect. And he was about to prove it to a room full of people who had forgotten what it meant to be human, rather than simply powerful. The drawing room of the Fiori estate felt like a courtroom as Dante and Alina entered, their footsteps echoing off marble floors that had witnessed 3 generations of family decisions that shaped European business and politics. Alessandro Fiori sat in his customary wingback chair by the fireplace, a man who at 87 still commanded absolute authority through presence alone. His amber eyes, so similar to Dante's, missed nothing as they took in every detail of Alina's appearance and bearing. But he was not alone. Arrayed around the room like judges in a tribunal were the key figures of the Fiori empire. Viviana, elegant and disapproving in her Milan couture, Uncle Roberto, whose banking connections had helped build the family fortune, Cousin Marco, who managed their European energy operations, and several board members whose presence indicated this was far more than a family meeting. It was a formal evaluation of Dante's fitness to continue leading their empire. "Sit," Alessandro commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. "Both of you." Dante guided Alina to a settee facing his grandfather, noting how she maintained perfect composure, despite being surrounded by people who clearly viewed her as a threat to everything they had built. Her posture was straight, her hands steady, her storm-grey eyes meeting Alessandro's gaze without flinching. Whatever else happened in this room, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "So," Alessandro began, his voice deceptively quiet, "this is the woman who has caused such disruption in our family's carefully maintained reputation. This is Alina Vasquez," Dante said firmly, "the woman I intend to marry." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, while Viviana made a sound that might have been a suppressed gasp. But Alessandro's expression didn't change, his ancient eyes continuing to study Alina with the intensity of a man who had built an empire by reading people's true natures. "Miss Vasquez," he said finally, addressing her directly, "do you understand what it means to be part of this family? The obligations, the scrutiny, the enemies who will use any weakness against us?" "I'm beginning to," Alina replied quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I understand that loving Dante means accepting a life that will never be truly private, that my every action will be judged not just as an individual, but as a reflection of the Fiori name. And yet you persist in this relationship, knowing the damage it could cause to everything we've built." "I persist because I love him," Alina said simply. "Not his money or his power or his position in the world, but the man who saw something worth protecting in a girl that most people would have dismissed as worthless." "Worthless," Alessandro repeated, tasting the word. "Is that how you see yourself, Miss Vasquez?" "It's how the world taught me to see myself," she admitted with devastating honesty. "My father made sure I understood that I was a burden, a mistake, something to be ashamed of. Foster care reinforced the lesson that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness I received, and never expect more than basic survival. But that changed." Alina glanced at Dante, her eyes softening in a way that was visible to everyone in the room. Dante changed it. He saw strength where I saw weakness, courage where I saw cowardice, beauty where I saw damage. He taught me that my worth isn't determined by other people's failures or cruelties. Touching, Viviana interjected with barely concealed disdain. But sentiment doesn't erase the fact that your mother nearly destroyed this family once before. How do we know you won't finish what she started? The attack was swift and vicious, designed to break Alina's composure and reveal whatever hidden agenda the family suspected she harbored. But instead of crumbling, Alina straightened, her voice gaining strength as she addressed the woman who had just tried to destroy her. My mother was a damaged woman who made terrible choices, she said clearly. She hurt people, including your family, and I can't undo that damage or erase the pain she caused. But I'm not my mother, just as Dante is not responsible for every decision his ancestors made. We are who we choose to be, not who our blood says we should be. Pretty words, Roberto said dismissively, but the Castellano organization seems to think you're worth using as leverage against us. What does that tell you about your value to our enemies? It tells me that they recognize something your family seems determined to ignore, Alina replied, her grey eyes flashing with steel that surprised everyone in the room. They understand that Dante's feelings for me are real, powerful enough to influence his decisions. What frightens you isn't that I might be using him. It's that he might choose love over obligation, happiness over duty. The silence that followed was electric with tension. No one had ever spoken to the assembled Fiori power structure with such directness, such unflinching honesty about their fears and motivations. Even Dante found himself amazed by Alina's courage, her refusal to be intimidated by people who were accustomed to absolute deference. Alessandro leaned forward slightly, his ancient eyes studying Alina with what might have been the beginning of respect. And if we demanded that Dante choose between you and his family, between his personal happiness and his responsibility to thousands of employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods, then I would tell him to choose what he could live with, Alina said without hesitation. I've survived abandonment before. I could survive it again if I had to. But I don't think you'll ask him to make that choice. And why is that? Because you're not the monsters you pretend to be, she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction. You're people who have spent so long protecting what you've built that you've forgotten why it was worth building in the first place. You've forgotten that power without love is just another form of emptiness. The words hit the room like physical blows, stripping away the careful facades and political calculations to reveal truths that no one wanted to acknowledge. Alessandro sat back in his chair, something that might have been amusement flickering in his eyes. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting indeed. Before anyone could respond, Williams appeared in the doorway with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. Sir, he said, addressing Dante, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. What kind of situation? Dante asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Castellano organization has accelerated their timeline. The fabricated evidence has been released to major media outlets, along with additional allegations that complicate the situation significantly. Show me, Alessandro commanded, and Williams activated a large screen that descended from the ceiling. Within moments, they were watching breaking news coverage that made the previous media attention seem tame by comparison. The fabricated documents were sophisticated and damning. Bank records showing mysterious payments from Alina to Rodriguez, photographs that appeared to show her in criminal enterprises, communications that suggested she had been working with the Castellanos to infiltrate the Fiori organization. The evidence was false but convincing enough to destroy both their reputations, if not immediately countered. But it was the final revelation that hit like a bomb. Medical records suggesting that Alina was pregnant with Dante's child, records that painted their relationship as a calculated attempt to trap him into marriage and secure access to the Fiori fortune. The pregnancy records are completely fabricated, Williams said quickly, seeing the shock on both Dante's and Alina's faces. But they're sophisticated enough to fool initial medical review. By the time independent verification proves they're false, the damage to your credibility will be irreversible. How long before this becomes the dominant narrative? Alessandro asked with the calm of someone who had weathered countless crises. Hours, Williams replied. Maybe less. The story is already trending on social media, and government officials are being asked to comment on whether someone involved in such scandals should continue to hold renewable energy contracts worth billions. The room erupted in controlled chaos as family members began calculating the damage and discussing damage control strategies, but Dante's attention was focused entirely on Alina, who had gone pale as she processed the implications of being painted as a pregnant criminal conspirator. "This has to stop," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the family's heated discussions. "I won't let them destroy everything you've worked for just to protect a relationship that's causing more harm than good." "Don't," Dante said sharply, recognizing the look in her eyes. "Don't even think about walking away. That's exactly what they want, to use their lies to drive us apart." "But what if staying together destroys everything else?" Alina asked, tears finally beginning to gather in her storm-gray eyes. "What if loving you costs you your empire, your family, your entire life's work?" "Then we'll build something new," Dante said fiercely, taking her hands in his and ignoring the family members who were watching their exchange with various degrees of fascination and horror. "Something better. Something that's ours." "Enough," Alessandro said quietly, but his voice carried such authority that the entire room fell silent. "Williams, what would be required to prove these allegations false?" "There's to one independent verification of all documents, which could take weeks, medical examination to disprove the pregnancy claims, which would require Miss Vasquez's cooperation, counterintelligence operations to expose the Castellano involvement, which would require revealing sources we prefer to keep confidential." "Time we don't have," Roberto observed grimly. "By the time we prove the allegations false, the political and business damage will be done." "Not necessarily," Alessandro said thoughtfully. "There is another option, one that would neutralize the Castellano strategy while simultaneously demonstrating our confidence in Miss Vasquez's integrity." All eyes turned to the family patriarch, who was studying Alina with an expression that had shifted from judgment to something that might have been calculation. "We embrace the narrative," he continued, "not the false allegations, but the underlying story. We announce that Dante and Miss Vasquez will be married immediately, that she is indeed carrying his child, and that the Fiori family is delighted to welcome her into our ranks." The suggestion hung in the air like a tactical nuclear weapon, radical in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. By embracing the story rather than fighting it, they would remove the Castellanos' ability to use it as leverage, while simultaneously demonstrating absolute confidence in Alina's character. "But she's not pregnant," Viviana protested. "She could be," Alessandro replied with the pragmatism that had built their empire. A quick civil ceremony followed by a more public celebration in a few months, by which time nature might have provided the necessary validation of our announcement. Dante felt his world tilt on its axis as he processed what his grandfather was suggesting. Not just acceptance of his relationship with Alina, but active embrace of it as a strategic advantage. The old man was turning the Castellanos' weapon against them, using their own fabricated narrative to strengthen rather than weaken the family's position. "You're serious," he said. "I am always serious when it comes to protecting this family," Alessandro replied. "Miss Vasquez has proven herself today to be exactly what you claimed she was, strong, intelligent, and devoted to your well-being above her own interests. More importantly, she has shown that she understands the true cost of power and is willing to pay it." He turned his attention back to Alina, his ancient eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to peer into her very soul. "The question is whether you're willing to accept what we're offering. Not just marriage to my grandson, but full membership in a family that will protect you with the same ruthlessness we use to destroy our enemies. A life of luxury and influence, but also one of constant scrutiny and endless obligation." Alina was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Not just love, but power. Not just acceptance, but adoption into one of Europe's most influential families. Everything she had never dared to dream of, but also everything that had terrified her about loving Dante. "And if I say no?" she asked quietly. "Then we help you disappear," Alessandro said simply. "New identity, new life, financial security in whatever part of the world you choose." Dante would eventually understand that it was for the best, and in time, He would find someone more suitable to his position. No, Dante began, but his grandfather silenced him with a gesture. This is her choice to make, Alessandro said firmly. She has earned the right to decide her own fate, without pressure from you or expectations from us. Alina stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens. The November landscape was bleak and windswept, but she could see past the winter to the promise of spring, to the possibility of new life growing from seemingly barren ground. My mother loved a Fiori man, she said finally, her voice carrying across the silent room. It destroyed her because she didn't understand the cost of that love, the strength required to survive in your world. She thought love alone would be enough. She turned back to face the assembled family, her grey eyes now holding a determination that surprised everyone present. But love isn't enough, is it? Love without courage is just another form of weakness. Love without commitment is just romance. Love without the willingness to fight for it every single day is just sentiment. And what do you have? Alessandro asked. I have love for your grandson that goes deeper than romance or sentiment, Alina said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I have the courage that comes from surviving things that should have destroyed me. And I have the commitment that comes from finally understanding what's worth fighting for. She moved to where Dante sat, taking his hands in hers and looking into his amber eyes with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. I love you, she said simply. Not just the man you are, but the man you become when you're with me. I love the family you're offering me, even the difficult parts, even the parts that will challenge everything I thought I knew about myself. And the risks? Dante asked. The constant scrutiny, the endless obligations, the enemies who will always be looking for ways to use you against me? Let them try, Alina said with a smile that was part promise and part threat. They have no idea what they're dealing with. I've survived poverty, abuse, abandonment, and betrayal. I think I can handle a few business rivals and social climbers. The laughter that escaped from Alessandro was genuine, the first time anyone in the room had seen him display real mirth in years. Yes, he said, rising from his chair with the dignity of old age and absolute authority. Yes, I think you can. He moved to where they stood together, placing his weathered hands on both their shoulders with the weight of generational blessing. Welcome to the family, Miss Vasquez, he said formally. May you bring to it the same strength and courage you've shown today. What followed was a whirlwind of activity that transformed the estate into the headquarters of a military campaign. Within hours, Williams had coordinated with media specialists, legal teams, and political operatives to craft a counter-narrative that would neutralize the Castellano attack. The engagement announcement was prepared with the precision of a corporate merger, complete with background briefings that emphasized Alina's resilience and strength rather than her humble origins. The pregnancy story was addressed directly. They would neither confirm nor deny the current allegations, but would let future developments speak for themselves. It was a masterpiece of political maneuvering that left their enemies with no clear angle of attack. But for Dante and Alina, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had faced the worst their respective worlds could throw at them, and emerged not just intact but stronger. The girl who had once cleaned floors was now poised to become one of Europe's most powerful women, while the man who had lived his entire life according to other people's expectations had finally chosen his own path. 3 months later, on a crisp February morning that promised spring was still possible, Dante and Alina stood in the private chapel of the Fiori estate, surrounded by family members who had come to genuinely respect the woman who had challenged everything they thought they knew about love, power, and the price of happiness. The wedding was small, elegant, and absolutely real in ways that none of the society ceremonies Dante had been expected to participate in ever could have been. Alina wore a simple ivory dress that emphasized her natural grace, while Dante wore the expression of a man who had finally found everything he had been searching for without knowing it. When Alessandro performed the traditional blessing in Italian, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of family history, both bride and groom understood that they were not just marrying each other, they were choosing to build something new from the foundation of everything that had come before. Do you, Dante Alessandro Fiori, take this woman to be your wife, your partner, your equal in all things for as long as you both shall live? I do, Dante said, his amber eyes never leaving Alina's face. "Do you, Alina Vasquez, take this man to be your husband, your protector, your greatest love, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Alina whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss they shared was witnessed by a room full of people who had learned that love, when it was real and fought for and protected with absolute determination, really could overcome any obstacle the world chose to throw at it. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Yorkshire moors in shades of gold and crimson, Alina Fiore stood in the gardens of Thornfield Manor, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, where new life grew with the promise of spring. The manor that had once felt like a prison had been transformed into a home, filled with laughter and warmth and the kind of love that made even ancient walls seem young again. Dante found her there as the sun set over the moors, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how completely she had transformed not just his life, but his understanding of what life could be. "Any regrets?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Just one," Alina said, leaning back against his chest with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. "What's that?" "I wish I could go back and tell that frightened girl cleaning corridors in this house that everything was going to be all right. That love really does exist, that it's possible to build something beautiful from the ashes of other people's mistakes, and that sometimes the fairy tale really does come true." "It wasn't a fairy tale," Dante said, his lips brushing against her ear. "It was better than that. It was real." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the ancient walls that had witnessed so much pain and finally, at last, perfect happiness, both of them understood that they had achieved something that neither money nor power could buy. They had found each other against impossible odds, fought for their love against forces that should have destroyed them, and built a life that was entirely their own. The girl who had once been nobody had become everything. The man who had thought he was cursed to live without love had discovered that some curses were actually blessings in disguise, and together they had proven that when love is real, when it's worth fighting for, when it's built on truth and trust and absolute commitment, it really can overcome anything the world throws at it. Even the darkness that once threatened to swallow them whole had become nothing more than shadows that made their light shine brighter. They were home. They were safe. They were together, and that, they both knew, was all that had ever really mattered.